what I find in my work is that it actually begins with your relationship with yourself. And so that if you're disconnected from yourself, it's really hard to connect with other people, because when you're not experiencing your inner world, you can't bring your full self into your relationships, which makes it really hard for other people to connect to you.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of Feel Good, the podcast. I'm your host, Malika Lee, and today I'm so excited to share with you my guest. But before we get to that, I'll just tell you that the topic we're going into today is how to have healthy, intimate relationships and why that's important. Okay, so now let me tell you about Angela. My guest is Angela Amias. She is a licensed clinical social worker and trauma-informed relationship therapist. As a relationship expert, she's been featured in publications like Oprah, Salon, Inc., Toronto Sun, Women's Health, and HuffPost, just to name a few. She is a trauma survivor, and as a licensed therapist, she's worked with hundreds of individuals and couples to help them heal their past traumas. She is also founder of the Institute for Trauma-Informed Relationships, along with her partner, Daniel Daniel Baskel-John, PhD. I did practice that, but did I say it right?
Baskel-John. You were
Baskel-John.
very close.
Thank you for that help with that. Baskel-John, PhD. Okay, so that's a little bit about Angela, a little bit about me. In addition to hosting and producing Feel Good, the podcast, I'm also a facilitator, spiritual teacher, and I like to call myself a midwife to people birthing their authentic lives. You can find out more about me on the feelgoodinstitute.com. Okay, so now let me tell you a little bit first before I tell you how we got here. Welcome, Angela.
Thank you so much, Malika, for having me.
I'm so excited. So I have to tell the listeners a little bit about how we got here. A friend of mine, shout out to Keish, sent me your quiz, your online quiz. And so I took the quiz and they asked for your email. They sent you, I'm saying they, meaning you, sent me an email, and it gave me an overview of characteristics of my relationship archetype. And we'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. But y'all, when I tell you, when I started to read that, and I started to cry, literally, like it just, I don't know what it was. I can't even put into words, but I literally started to cry. I just felt so seen. And maybe there were certain things that I had been aware of within myself that weren't fully conscious, but it just named it and called it out. And even now, I just start tearing up a bit. And I've sent this quiz to some friends, and another friend also had the same reaction. She was like, I'm crying reading this.
Wow.
And so I had to reach out to you because, when I find something good, it's like, I want to share it. And I'm so grateful that I can share you, that you've accepted this invitation, and that I can share some of your work with our listeners today.
Thank you so much for having me. And thanks for sharing those your experience, because so often when we create something, we put it out into the world, we don't really know how it's landing with other people. But for Daniel and I, our goal with creating the archetypes and creating the descriptions was for people to feel like they were under a compassionate microscope, so to speak, that they would feel seen and validated and honored for who they are. So
absolutely. Well done. I think mission accomplished. Okay, so we kind of jumped right in with the archetypes. So listeners, will delve into that in just a little bit. But before we get there, we're going to set this up a little bit so we have shared languaging and understanding, and then we'll get into the archetypes and explain a little bit more about that. Okay, so how would you define, with your expertise and experience, a healthy, intimate relationship?
Well, I think that there are certain qualities that are always going to be present in a healthy relationship. And it isn't that you're always going to feel that they are present in any particular moment. For example, when a couple is in the midst of an argument, they may not feel very positively toward their partner in that moment, but we're really looking at overall, I think, the question of, do I feel like my partner has my back? Right? Are they going to be there for me when I need them? Another question is, um, do I feel seen by my partner for who I really am? Um, Another thing is to ask yourself, does it feel to me like my needs and my feelings matter to my partner? Are they affected by what I'm experiencing? And um, another question is just, do I feel safe with this person? Right? Because safety is obviously the foundation of any relationship. We need to feel safe with the other person. And then the question that I always like to ask after kind of going through these qualities is, if you are not able to say yes to a question, say for example, do I feel like I can lean on my partner when I need support? It isn't necessarily, if you're not able to say yes, it isn't necessarily the case that your partner isn't there for you. It might also be that you don't allow yourself to lean on the other person. And so when we're looking at all of these qualities of what a healthy relationship is, it isn't an examination of, is your partner a healthy person, so much as it is, are whoever is in the relationship, are we together creating the conditions to have a healthy relationship? Are we bringing our authentic selves into the relationship so that we can be known by our partner? Or are we kind of holding back and hiding parts of ourselves because we're not sure how they will be received by the other person?
Yes. So if I followed you correctly, which I think I did, it's like, how comfortable are you in your relationship? And this could be romantic, it could be a friendship, a close friendship, it could be familial, but how comfortable am I to show up fully and be well
Yeah,
received and accepted and feel safe?
absolutely. Yeah.
So now that we have an understanding of a healthy, intimate relationship, why is it important to have them?
Well, humans are an interdependent species. We exist within the fabric of our relationships. While we as Americans have this myth of the independent person who goes out and pulls themselves up by their bootstraps, that's not actually the way that we work as humans. In every culture, we actually really depend on our relationships. And if there's one thing that the research shows over and over and over again, it's that the quality of our connections with other people, the quality of our relationships, really determines the quality of our emotional well-being, our mental health, and our physical health.
Yes, and I was telling Angela before we started recording, I've been reading Emotional Intelligence. It's a classic. And I just wanted to highlight very briefly, there was a study, I'm going to paraphrase it, but it was done in Sweden in 1993, where they followed 752 men, basically offering them a free medical exam. And part of the exam also asked them if they were under intense emotional stress. So those that reported they were having intense emotional distress had a death rate 3 times higher than those who said their lives were calm and placid. Yet, among the men who said that they had a dependable web of intimacy, a wife or close friends, and this is 7 years later after their initial meeting, they had no relationship whatsoever between high stress levels and death rate, meaning that their physical well-being, just like what you said, was directly correlated to having a support system to navigate probably those challenging situations.
And those results from that study have been replicated in a number of different areas, looking at survival rates for women with breast cancer, for example. There are a lot of situations in which we really we can't control how much stress we experience. We can't prevent upheavals in our lives. I mean, if the pandemic showed anything, it's obviously we have minimal control over some of the things that happen in life. But what we can do is really nurture our relationships with other people in that way that we feel a sense of support as we're going through, the challenges that life presents.
Yes, and it's so interesting because I've been hearing studies about people feeling more disconnected and lonely now. And, it could be technology, it could be being more of a nomadic, we're more of a nomadic
Mhm.
generation where we're not staying in the same cities as our families of origin usually. And so it seems like these relationship skills are so important, but they're not being taught really, or their importance isn't being stressed. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, we're never told what a healthy relationship looks like, or how to have a healthy relationship, or what kinds of skills we're going to need to create fulfilling, meaningful relationships. And loneliness is a huge problem. The Surgeon General just came out recently with a statement about loneliness as a public health issue, because it has such a huge impact on people's physical health as well as mental health. Um, the mortality rate, the risk factor of loneliness is actually more than obesity and smoking combined, which
Wow.
most of us don't realize. And it isn't just an American problem. The government in the UK has had a minister of loneliness for several years now that's really looking at how to help people have stronger connections within their community, and within their kind of social networks. And I think, from my perspective, what I find in my work is that it actually begins with your relationship with yourself. And
Mm.
so that if you're disconnected from yourself, it's really hard to connect with other people, because when you're not experiencing your inner world, you can't bring your full self into your relationships, which makes it really hard for other people to connect to you. And so, um, when I'm working with people who are experiencing a lot of loneliness, we actually really start with reconnecting that inner relationship with self. And then from there, bridge out to how do you have that kind of relationship with other people.
That's so interesting. So, what I'm guessing, but I want to hear you say it. What is the cause of the disconnect in the first place with the person in a relationship with themselves?
I think it really stems from, we're actually live in a really shame-based culture. A lot of parenting is shame-based. Don't do that. You're too old for that. You're acting like a 2-year-old. You're not hurt. Stop crying. Those sorts of things. But our educational system is actually fairly shame-based as well, because shame is a really effective way to control children. And so, because what that kind of parenting and education is doing is threatening a child's sense of belonging. And because again, we are this interdependent species, we have to maintain a sense of belonging within our groups, right? That is vital to our survival as children, but also as adults as well. And so, what shame feeds for people is this sense of self-judgment and being wrong, right? Being not good enough or not the right way. And so the more we experience that, the more we kind of push down on any uncomfortable feelings that arise. We don't know how to meet ourselves with compassion and kindness. And so, from my perspective, that disconnection really starts to grow in childhood, and it's combined with not knowing how to handle our emotions. And
Mm.
so, humans are very emotional. We experience a lot of emotions beginning really early in life and then continuing through the rest of our lives. But what most of us learn to do is just push push those feelings back down,
Yeah.
right? And as soon as we're doing that, we're automatically disconnected from ourselves because we have no idea how we're even feeling.
Yes. Yes, that's really deep. So, is the shame based, is that linked to, we mentioned trauma earlier, and you being a trauma informed therapist, where does the trauma connect with the shame, or where does it fit into what you just shared?
So, going back to the idea that we all need to maintain a sense of belonging in order to feel safe as children, I look at trauma as that sense of belonging that's been ruptured. So there's some kind of, we perceive a threat to our connection with our caregivers, right? Maybe they're disconnected and, in cases where somebody has an addiction and they can't actually be mentally and emotionally present with a child. There's some kind of ruptured connection that doesn't get repaired. And so when that happens, obviously in all parent child relationships there's going to be ruptures in connection. No parents are perfect and there's no expectation that parents be perfect. So it's really that repair that becomes really critical. And so, an example is if father's having a really difficult day and had a really hard time at work and then is, caring for his 2-year-old and his 2-year-old's running around like crazy and the dad snaps, right? Just stop it. And immediately the child freezes because that's perceived as a threat to connection and belonging. And the father sees that and is able to say, okay, hold on, and do the kind of reconnection piece. Then that experience isn't traumatic to a child. But when that happens over and over in it through a child's life without having that repair, what children do, what we all do as kids, is we learn, how do I need to be in order to stay safe? How do I need to be in order to not threaten my belonging within this family or with this parent? And so that's how I think of trauma, is really that continual experience of that ruptured connection.
Mhm. So, one of the things that I really pride the podcast on is experiential learning. So, we'll get in, of course, this is the experience of your therapeutic work, but we'll get to your personal experience of healing in just a moment. I think, but what you've set up, I think, so well is talking a bit more about the relationship archetypes. Because when you said about how do I need to be in order to stay connected or to stay in relationship with this person, I think that feeds right into how the archetypes are formed. So can we go down that path now?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Is it okay if I start by just sharing kind of how Daniel and I ended up developing the relationship archetypes, where they came from?
Please do. And I want to just say, so there's a couple of ways to go forward as a listener in this episode. One, you can pause us right now and take the quiz yourself and see where you shake out in your predominant. The quiz will just give you your highest ranking archetype. Or you can listen to this conversation and kind of suss out based on the descriptions which archetype you fall into. And we'll also talk about what an archetype is, just in case some of you listening do not know, and how important and valuable I found them to be personally. And we'll go from there. So, Angela, do you mind just telling them the website, even though I have it in the description?
Absolutely. So if you would like to take the quiz, you can go to alchemyoflove.org/quiz.
Awesome. Okay. Please tell us the background.
Okay. So in the fall of 2022, I was reading the amazing memoir, What My Bones Know, by Stephanie Fu. And it's a memoir of her own experience of having complex PTSD stemming from childhood trauma. And I was just a few chapters into the book when she describes her experience of getting this diagnosis from her therapist and then turning to the internet and books to figure out what this meant for her. And what she concluded based on the descriptions from trauma researchers and trauma books was that she was fundamentally broken, that she herself had developed a toxic personality that wasn't good for anyone else to be in relationship with her because she was so damaged by her PTSD, and that there was basically no hope for her. And we've certainly heard this from a few of our course participants as well, this sense of before finding our work that they had felt doomed to have terrible relationships through adulthood because of their childhood experiences. And just as I was sitting there reading Stephanie Foo's description of what she experienced, I found it incredibly heartbreaking. And I just thought, this is not right. This isn't accurate. This isn't true. And how heartbreaking is it for someone to experience a childhood with so much pain, but then grow up into an adult who feels like her whole life is going to be colored by those childhood experiences. And I think it made me realize that if I thought about the trauma books that I had read, that was certainly the predominant message was trauma is so terrible and so bad that people are just permanently damaged by their experiences. Thankfully, I had already healed
Mhm.
significantly from my childhood experiences and had walked many of my clients through this experience before I ever really started to read a lot of the books that are popular now related to trauma. And so it hadn't colored my experience or my belief in what was possible for me. And it hadn't colored my experience or belief for what was possible for my clients. But I realized we really need a new narrative around trauma and recovery and healing. And so that's when I said to Daniel, my partner and my co-creator, it's true that trauma affects relationships, but it isn't the way that people are describing it. And he said, okay, well, what is it? And I started to describe the patterns that people develop out of childhood that they bring into their adult relationships. And then we could see really clearly that there were 5 distinct patterns that people exhibit in their relationships. And that's when we decided, well, let's just call those the 5 relationship archetypes and go from there to start bringing them out into the world.
Oh, that's amazing. I love that it is about hope. And you're right as far as that doom. Or I remember I used to work with children, and one of my the coordinators of the program I was a part of was saying something about 3 traumas and then, kids trajectory. And I was like, that's not true because I'm sure I've experienced way more than 3. And I'm like,
Yeah,
I think I'm doing okay.
absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are the 5 archetypes, and does everybody have one? Or are there any outliers where it's like none of them apply to a person?
You know, I haven't come across any. I mean, I've worked with hundreds of people, and as I was creating these, I wanted to make sure that I could, like, anybody that I thought of, I wanted to make sure I could say, "Oh, yeah, they're this or they're this." I would say though that as we develop more and more of our capacity for having deep relationships, we start to integrate all of these archetypes. And so the idea behind the archetypes, it's unlike some personality test that you might take where you're this one type. The archetypes work in such a way that when we're born, we have access to all of them. It's just that through our childhood experiences, we hone in on that one that's going to give us the best chance of maintaining safety and belonging in the family that we're growing up in. And so a process through adulthood is is regaining access to all of the positive qualities of the archetypes. And so while I would say that I don't think there's anyone that falls outside of the archetypes, I would say that there are people who have done the work of kind of reclaiming parts of themselves so that they have access to several of them, if not all of them, to at least, three, maybe even four archetypes. So,
Okay. So they've been so patiently waiting. We've kept you waiting long enough.
okay.
What are the five archetypes, Angela?
Okay. Well, let's start with the innocent dreamer. And so the innocent dreamer archetype is one that um, we all probably access really strongly when we fall in love. It is the archetype that is immensely hopeful, has a vision for how things could be. I mean, the innocent dreamer loves the fairy tale happily ever after. Um, and I think the other part of the innocent dreamer is that one of their gifts is that they can see the potential for another person, for a partner, for the relationship. They can see that so clearly that for a lot of innocent dreamers that I've worked with, it actually overshadows their ability to look at the reality of the relationship as it is. And so that's really the risk that innocent dreamers run into, is having difficulty letting go of a relationship where they can see what could be and they can almost taste it, but it isn't there. And so for innocent dreamers, there's a tendency to overlook red flags in relationships and to invest everything they have into trying to support their partner into becoming the version of themselves that fulfills their potential. And so for innocent dreamers, a lot of the work is bringing that vision back to the self and really focusing on their own individual potential and how to nurture that and be able to look at the reality of the relationship and ask, is my partner actually invested in, growing themselves, or am I trying to pull them along in this way, or am I putting myself into a situation that isn't good for me in the hopes that someday it will be what I can see it could be.
I didn't pick up on this until listening to you just now. I'm like, oh, those are the fixer uppers. Like if you have, I find that women generally tend to do that more, where they'll, see a guy and kind of fix him up, right?
Yep.
Invest in him and all those things. And I realize now that that's aligned with the innocent dreamer in some ways.
Absolutely. We always say that the innocent dreamer is drawn to the diamond in the rough. Emphasis on in the rough, right? Yeah.
Okay, got it. And I realized that we didn't explain, for someone who's not familiar with the term archetypes, can you just give a quick overview or definition of what an archetype is?
Absolutely. So there are obviously archetypes as sort of figures that might appear in fairy tales. There's a kind of that sort of role that someone might take. The way that we think of it with the relationship archetypes, that's maybe a little easier to wrap your head around, is like your relationship personality or your relationship style. Sort of what kind of role you tend to occupy in your relationship.
Got it. And if someone is still like, oh, that's vague, we're surrounded by archetypes. So I thought of this the other day. A familiar archetype that we don't really classify as an archetype are our astrology signs. Right?
Definitely.
Like each astrology sign, they say, have characteristics and, gifts and abilities and challenges. And so those are archetypes that the listener may already be familiar with, but never really called them an archetype.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we covered the innocent dreamer.
Okay. So then we have the sunny romantic. And the sunny romantic is someone who is highly sensitive by nature, right? So very sensitive to sensory experiences, very able to experience pleasure and joy. Oftentimes sunny romantics really gravitate to the outdoors or to music, or really love food, or or wine or things like that that have to do with sensory pleasures. And so that's one of the gifts of the sunny romantic, is being very in tune with the physical world, with their bodies. So they're often very sensual people, who really value sexual connection and relationships. Um, and then the sort of challenge for sunny romantics is actually being able to go into the inner world and to their own kind of emotional experience and the more kind of difficult aspects of relationships and their own feelings. And so um when I work with sunny romantics, I think oftentimes they're not the ones to come into therapy so much as their partner is like, We need some help because I can't talk to you. I can't engage you. We need to work through these issues and you're just not willing to do that." And so what I see a lot is because sunny romantics really struggle with connecting with those more difficult emotions, they are really not able to work through issues in their relationship, and their strategy in relationships is just to try to keep everything good, right? And so oftentimes that looks like, oh, you're upset, what do I need to do in this moment to just kind of make everything okay, because I don't want it to go, another direction. But for a lot of sunny romantics, if their partner keeps pushing, no, no, we really need to talk about this. We can't keep avoiding this. Oftentimes, sunny romantics will get flooded and overwhelmed and can even sometimes explode because they're just not equipped to really regulate their emotional experience.
Mhm. Okay. So we got the innocent dreamer, the sunny romantic. Which one is up next?
Okay. So then we have the abundant nurturer. So the abundant nurturer is pretty much as it sounds, somebody whose way of being in relationships is to try to meet the other person's needs and take care of the other person. And obviously, the abundant nurturer is an essential archetype for relationships because care and nurture are a big part of relationships. But where the abundant nurturer really struggles is in being able to set boundaries or say no or express their own needs. And so when I work with an abundant nurturer, one of my first clues is that they're experiencing a lot of resentment to other people in their lives, not just a partner, but also their boss or their coworkers who keep putting more work on them, or their best friend who keeps asking for help with this or that and doesn't seem to realize that, they don't have unlimited energy. The abundant nurturer is so good at attuning to other people and seeing what they need. And they tend to be so skilled at getting stuff done that oftentimes people in their lives are actually oblivious to the fact that they're overriding the abundant nurturer's boundaries because it just looks like they're doing great on the outside. So there's this disconnect between their inner experience where it can be, thinking of the words of a good friend of mine who's an abundant nurturer is like, I have needs too. And then the question becomes, yes, but do you ever actually express those needs? Like, you have them and you're hoping that somebody's gonna see them without you having to actually express them. And so that's the kind of the growth edge for abundant nurturers.
And this one is a really interesting component because that selflessness or putting other people's needs before their own and maybe even negating or disconnecting from what their needs are is lauded, would say, specifically around the archetype of mother, right? Like,
Oh, absolutely.
and women,
Absolutely.
yeah, like being a
Yes.
wife and,
Yes.
supporting your
I
husband or partner.
my good friend who is an abundant nurturer, she took the quiz and then she texted and she was like, I'm so upset. I can't believe I got abundant nurture. And I was like, well, see, like you kind of saw it coming, right? Um, but yeah, I think that especially for women who have been mothers, it's just this expectation that you should always be giving, you should always give, you should never say no, and that's a really problematic role that mothers are socialized into.
Mhm. Whew. I haven't called out the ones that are the highest to resonate with me. We'll get there. So I know
Okay.
that we have a couple more left.
Yeah. So the next one that I'll talk about is the passionate warrior. And so the passionate warrior is someone who learned early on in life, I can't depend on anyone else. If something's going to get done, it's because I do it. And I need to just know how to depend on myself. And so where the abundant nurturer really struggles with um voicing their needs and feeling like they can set boundaries, passionate warriors are really good at saying, nope, that's my boundary. Not going to, we're not going to go there. Right. Passionate warriors, unlike sunny romantics, are not afraid of conflict typically. They're pretty good at, if they're upset about something, letting the other person in the relationship know. But where they struggle is learning how to lean on another person and to take that risk of trusting. I don't have to do it all myself. I can actually ask for help and someone's going to be there to support me. And so that's really the work of the passionate warrior in relationships, is learning how to trust that if I lean, you're going to be there to support me.
I have stories about that one. We get to. Okay. And then last but not least.
The last is the hidden gem. I have such a special place in my heart for hidden gems. Um, Having worked with so many of them, the hidden gem is somebody who knows themselves really well. So they're deeply in touch with their inner world and they have a rich inner world. But because in childhood they learned that they got the message, who I am authentically is not right. It's I'm too much or I'm not enough of this. Hidden gems have learned how to kind of spread themselves out between a number of relationships. And so what's interesting with hidden gems is that if you meet a hidden gem in one situation, you might know not a totally different person, but you might know somebody differently than if another person meets that hidden gem in a different situation. And so in one place, they might be, the kind of life of the party. And in another place, they might be the deep, sensitive artist type who, is really introspective and thoughtful. And so the work for the hidden gem, because a number of hidden gems I've worked with have come to me like, my relationships always fizzle out. I'm in a relationship for a few years and I get really bored and then I start looking elsewhere and maybe I'm just not equipped to have an intimate relationship with one person, right? And certainly not everyone needs to have an intimate relationship with one other single person, but for hidden gems it becomes a source of frustration that they start a relationship and then it just is doesn't it just fizzles. And the work for hidden gems is really to learn how to bring their whole authentic self into a single relationship, whether that's a friendship or a intimate partnership, to learn how to be themselves and trust that the people that they choose to have in their worlds are going to be able to receive them just as they are.
Hmm. So, taking a step back for just a moment, because we've talked about the healing and the trauma, how is knowing your archetype helpful? How does this support people on their healing journey?
Well, I think it is helpful because once you recognize the patterns that are popping up repeatedly in your relationships, and once you connect that to your relationship archetype, one of the things that we do is help people to understand, hey, this isn't coming out of nowhere. Like this is happening for a reason, right? And so for hidden gems, for example, it's that you're seeing this pattern in your relationships because you haven't learned how to feel safe just being yourself in relationships. And by the way, you've been choosing, because hidden gems are excellent at reading other people. So they're really keyed into what other people like and would, and they kind of mirror themselves around what they think the other person wants in a partner, which obviously then leads them into relationships that aren't necessarily a good fit for them. But the other thing that happens is that, again, we can't have a relationship with a persona, with somebody's mask. And so knowing your archetype helps you to recognize, okay, these are my patterns and here's why they're happening, right? And so for innocent dreamers, for example, okay, I need to be aware of my tendency to overlook those early red flags, because red flags show up in relationships within the first 3 to 6 months for sure,
Mhm.
sometimes sooner. And so that's how I think it's part of the healing journey is to be able to recognize your patterns and compassionately understand why this is something that you struggle with, and then to also know what your gifts are as well.
Mhm. Yeah, I resonate with a lot of that. So, okay, so let's roll up our sleeves and dig in because I've taken
Okay.
quiz in the course. I know that you're an expert in it. So let's talk about our traumas, our
All
archetypes,
right.
our healing journey, and
Perfect.
and get in there. Okay, so what is your archetype?
I'm a passionate warrior.
Okay, I'm a hidden gem is my predominant one. And I was like, oh yeah, the podcast and being able to, connect to people and meet them where they
Mhm.
are, like all of these things. So can you share with us a little bit more about, let's say, the trauma and how knowing you're a passionate warrior, how that's played out in the healing of your traumas?
Sure. So I will say that I haven't always been a passionate warrior. I've actually seen this kind of progression through the archetypes, through relationships. And so, I grew up in a really violent, scary home where it definitely wasn't safe to let down your guard. And when I left home when I was 17, and I really have had to rely on myself through, from an early age. And so, that whole message feels so believable to me that anytime I recognize I really need to, say, lean on my partner, it's like, oh, but it's scary because, if you lean and nobody catches you, you're going to fall over. And so, and I would say, when I my first serious relationship after I became an adult, I was 100% an innocent dreamer. I mean, I was like, this is it, man. I'm 18 and I have found the one, and so it was such a good lesson for me, working through that process of realizing you can love someone and they can love you, but that does not on its own make for a healthy relationship, especially with two people with trauma. And so that first serious relationship of mine, we both brought our own childhood traumas, and they did not play well together in a relationship. And so I learned a lesson which I think none of us are ever told we're going to learn in adulthood, which is that you can love someone, and love on its own isn't enough to have a healthy relationship.
Mhm,
Yeah.
absolutely. So did you so you had that first relationship and you had your experiences of the traumas. So when did you get to the place of finally reaching that edge of like of the healing part? I know you were helping other people heal, but what did that look like for you?
I think, my healing actually started quite, I actually got into being a trauma therapist and then a relationship therapist because of my own experiences. I think it's maybe a well-kept secret, maybe not, that most therapists, and I've worked with a number of therapists as clients, we're drawn to the work because we want to heal, we want to understand ourselves as well. And so I would say that my healing really started when I had children. And I was 21 when I had my oldest son. And I had three children by the time I was 26. And so I was full on abundant nurturer right there. I mean, no boundaries, no self, no needs. I didn't have needs. But it was actually a very healing time in my life because I got to nurture little children and give them something that I didn't get. And that in and of itself was a kind of a reparenting experience of I will give you and experience it vicariously through you that, when you cry, I tend to you in a sensitive way. And that really started my healing journey and was a big part of that initial piece of kind of recovering from that childhood trauma. And then through becoming a trauma therapist, obviously learning a lot of techniques and strategies for working with trauma. And what I came to see was that ultimately, when it comes to what's called relational trauma, which is trauma that happens in relationships, what heals that kind of trauma is relationships. And you
Mm,
really can't heal relational trauma without being close and intimate with other people.
wow.
And so that's where I transitioned from being a trauma therapist to a trauma informed relationship therapist and really starting to help people heal within the context of their relationships.
Mhm. And that's a challenge because generally our unhealed parts of the and this is my theory, let me know what you think about this. And it's not just mine, I've heard other people say it too, is that the unconscious part of us, the unhealed part of us, is attracting people that'll help us heal those parts, right? So it's like not really a good match. So then how can that still be the same container or vehicle to help a person get to healing when they're attracting someone who might be, like an unhealthy parent or something?
Yeah. You know, I it's that is such a great question because absolutely. If I'm working with someone and it is not a healthy relationship, I will always say this relationship is perfect for you because it's forcing you to look at these patterns that otherwise you're going to continue to repeat again and again. And so I would say that there's no there it's not realistic to expect that you're going to come into a relationship somehow healed of all of your past trauma, right? Um Daniel and I have very much appreciated how each of us has brought more stuff up from childhood that was still lingering down there. We talk about it like we're just sweeping out the corners, those old corners where we've stashed some old things from childhood.
Mhm.
But what makes a healthy relationship is that you're in it with someone else who's committed to growing and learning and changing, because in that case, you know, lots of things can come up and it's not like every moment of the relationship is going to be healthy, but that you actually take those experiences of things that happen and you learn from them. And so if you're in a relationship with another person who's committed to doing that kind of work, great. You keep going, right? You keep working through the things that come up. And if you're in a relationship with somebody who's saying very clearly, "Well, I didn't sign up for this. I'm actually good with how I am," right? Or someone who says, "Yeah, yeah, I'll change," but then never actually takes that personal initiative to do that work, then it really is a relationship that's more about your own personal growth and your ability to come to a point of saying, "Okay, is have I worked on this enough? Am I able to leave this relationship and seek something that is a better fit for me?" So one
Mhm.
of the questions that I always ask people who are in a relationship like that is if things stayed the same for the next 5 years, would you still be in this is this a relationship that you want for yourself? And most people are able to use that question to just know immediately, is this a relationship that is working, or is this a relationship that I can only imagine myself staying in if something changed and something changed dramatically?
Mm,
And when it's the latter, then the question is, do you see that, is this a mutual partnership? Are If you're invested in growth, do you see that your partner is also invested in growth too? Because if not, you're just holding on, hoping that something's going to change in the future. Yeah.
mhm. And what you're saying brings up for me an interesting thing, but I think you just covered it in that sometimes when we've had enough of these patterns play out, there gets to be a point sometimes where we stop trusting ourselves, right? Or stop trusting our picker. Um,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, will you speak on that? And
Yeah,
I think that looking for the
absolutely.
growth aspect does help. Like, okay, well, if they're willing to work at things, but what do you have to say to those that have had enough string of bad relationships, and they're kind of a little apprehensive about trusting
Mhm.
themselves to get into relationships?
I I do not believe that anyone is doomed to repeat relationship patterns indefinitely. I think that, so I have certainly worked with people who've been through multiple abusive relationships. And they'll, you know, they'll meet someone and they'll seem different on the surface and they'll think, okay, this is a good one, right? And then they'll get into it and then those patterns will start up again. And so it's actually a matter of believing that you can trust yourself when you're in the relationship. And what I mean by that is that you can trust what you're seeing, you can trust what you're feeling. Because in my experience, when people repeat those unhealthy, toxic, or abusive relationships over and over, they're stuck in this pattern of blaming themselves for what's happening. And so it's that experience of what Freud called trauma repetition, which is that we take the things from childhood that we haven't healed and we play them out in relationships, right? And so ideally, the way that that goes is to be able to see, oh, I don't have the power to change anyone. I actually could never have made my mom be the mother that I wanted her to be. It actually wasn't me
Mhm.
who was responsible for the fact that I didn't get what I needed when I was a kid. It actually wasn't about me not being good enough. This was all my mom had to give. And now in my relationship, this is all my partner has to give, and it's actually not enough for me. And I can't make them be more.
Mhm. That's a tough realization when some people get there, but also it can be liberating, right? That can be
It
the
is.
point, yeah, where the
Yeah.
healing
And
really begins.
I think for people that I've worked with who have made that transition, then they meet someone who is a healthy, available partner. Again, not perfect, but healthy and available. And that whole, what they felt like when they first came to see me was this cycle that they were just doomed to repeat again and again. They actually saw, oh, I just needed to learn something. And now I've learned it and I can move on.
Yes, got it. Okay, so um, I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about forgiveness because we've talked about our caregivers or our parents and how the trauma or challenges can start there. So what role does forgiveness have in that, whether it's forgiving ourselves, forgiving our parents, forgiving partners? Like, please speak on forgiveness and the healing.
Yeah. So I'll talk about forgiveness with parents first, because I think a lot of times when we're talking about childhood trauma or child abuse or things like that, neglect, abandonment, there's a kind of unspoken assumption that what we're doing is we're blaming parents for not being good enough. Um and I think that the reality is to be able to hold two things at once, which is, one is these things that happened when you were a child really hurt. That's real. But the second is that trauma is actually something that just gets passed down through generations. And so what we see with parents is really wounded children who've become parents, right? And so one of the things that has helped me is to be able to look at family members and see them as children. And as soon as I can see them as children, I can see their pure, innate goodness that was wounded along the way. And so the wounds that then were passed on to me weren't coming from their place of making an actual choice to do that so much as it was an expression of their own woundedness. And so that was what really laid the groundwork for me to be able to start to forgive people in my own family for what happened when I was a child. And I will say, for what I've experienced with my clients, is that oftentimes people are hesitant to even express what happened to them as children because they're afraid I'm going to blame their parents. And really, it's a matter of taking that compassionate lens on parents while also not discounting or diminishing or dismissing what those painful experiences in childhood actually felt like.
Yeah. There's so many layers to that. So I mentioned before taking your course and that I was a hidden gem, and it was so interesting to read up on the other archetypes because I feel like I've already gotten to a great place of forgiveness with my mom. Like that relationship, I really can say, and I've felt this way for years, that it's been healed. My relationship with my father, on the other hand, because I know what it feels like, it's like, oh, I still got some daddy issues I'm working through, you know, to be real.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
there was like a part of me that consciously or unconsciously like still caught myself blaming him for things. That's how I knew I wasn't healed, right? And I'm like, okay, I want to be free. So if I really want to be free, I have to take responsibility, which means not blaming. So I know all these things intellectually. And one of the things, and I've been like working through this off and on for years. My father passed in 2014. So um reading The Passionate Warrior dovetailed, like it helped bring to life. So to say a little bit more about the hidden gems, one of the things, um I hope it's okay to say about the hidden
Oh,
gems, okay,
please.
is about in some ways not trusting themselves
Mhm.
and how they can be a bit unconventional in how they see life. And so they may have grown up with a parent or a caregiver that had maybe more of a rigid view of how the world should
Mhm.
work and how they should be.
This is
And
so hidden gem. I just have to say everything that you're saying. Yep, yep, yep. That's absolutely yes.
yes, okay, so that kind of resonated. It wasn't all the way conscious, but then when I read The Passionate Warrior, which my dad was the passionate warrior, and I didn't experience his like advocacy necessarily in front of me. I'm sure
Mhm.
it probably went on behind the scenes at certain places. But what I did experience was my experience of feeling his criticism, of feeling like he thought he knew what was right, and that if I didn't agree with him, that I was wrong. And I was like, and I still find in some of those areas, like I still dance with it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, no wonder that's why I'm blaming him, is because I'm still second guessing myself. And that was one of the things that, yeah, that
Wow.
reading The Hidden Gem and then and then it made me
Yeah.
have such compassion for him, because he would always say about how he didn't ask for help, or how he, you know what I'm saying, felt like he had
Mhm.
to do it all himself. And I have felt like that at a different stage, like when we were talking about you can be different archetypes, but it helped me have compassion and to understand him
Yeah.
better.
And one other element of the passionate warrior that I want to bring to light here is that, and speaking as a passionate warrior myself, passionate warriors are terrified of being wrong.
Mhm.
And that's where that whole my way is right, your way is wrong comes from, is that if I have to rely on myself, I better get it right. And
Mhm.
if I see somebody who's doing it differently, that feels like a threat to my sense of safety. And I don't know if that helps with your dad as well, just the fear that was underlying that insistence of being right.
Yes, yes, I really get it. And he, his mother passed away, who was his primary parent when he was only 21. And so
Wow.
he's had to, navigate. He was doing the best that he could, but that helped me understand those dynamics a bit
Yeah.
more and to be able to have language of, oh, this is what was happening for him. And I
Yeah.
can see how my unconventional beliefs, it was a perfect recipe, as relationships tend to be, right?
Yeah. But also for you to then look back and say, oh, I was never wrong.
Yeah.
I how I was never wrong.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so I just want to say that again to reflect the power of this work and the power of this conversation to help people get free, and to see some of
Yeah.
those trauma responses or experiences and how we interpreted them from a different vantage point.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I think the truth with forgiveness is that none of us are free until we're all free, in the sense that forgiving other people and forgiving ourselves go hand in hand, right? And so it's a process of moving back and forth. And again, when it comes to forgiveness, there's also, you're finding things in the corners, right? It's like, oh, I didn't notice that. Okay, I had overlooked how I was still holding on to that piece. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. So for those that are listening, they're like, wow, okay, this was a lot of information. This is important though. Like, I want to do something about this. I know that my relationships maybe aren't feeding me as much as they could be. And that might be in part me, that might also be in part of who I'm attracting. So, what are like three small steps that someone can take in the direction of having healthier, more intimate relationships, of feeling more satisfaction and connection?
The first thing that comes to mind is making a commitment to listen to yourself. So I think a lot of us, we don't listen to ourselves. We don't take the time to really listen. And whether that means listening and trusting our gut or listening to what we really want, that's the first piece to me, is that healthy relationships rely on both people understanding what's happening in here, right? Because otherwise we're just behaving unconsciously in relationships and we don't even know why we're doing the things that we're doing, because we're cut off from here. And the next thing I would say is trusting what you hear. And so when you listen to yourself and you get really clear kinds of that inner voice is speaking to you, to trust it, right? To not slip into criticizing yourself or rationalizing or arguing, or but to really listen and then trust. And the last piece is really being yourself in the relationship. If somebody else doesn't respond well to you, if they don't like your perspective on a certain thing, or it's not actually about you, that's going on in their world. And to learn how to be yourself in a relationship without needing to get that approval from the other person that you're not giving yourself.
Mm, okay. Yeah, yeah, that was it all goes back to your relationship with yourself. I get
It
that.
really does. Yeah.
Hmm. And I would just say, because I just was having an inner dialogue with myself yesterday in relationship, not even with deep relationship, but I would say the other part is like the courage to act on, because you can listen and be connected. But if that action bumps up against those archetype patterns of they won't like
Hmm.
me, or they, I'm the nurturer and I have to give,
Yep.
even if I don't
Yep.
feel like giving, then I would just encourage, and I'm still on the journey as we all are, right? But just to have the courage
Yeah.
to interrupt that pattern or to challenge that relationship, and to
And
honor our relationship with ourselves is maybe just as important, if not more important, than our relationship with other people at times.
mhm. Yeah. And the courage is a piece, it's a huge piece of it,
Mhm.
because if we don't have the courage to take that leap of faith and do something different that breaks out of those old patterns, we never get to actually see the evidence that we can be safe outside of those old patterns that keep us so restricted. And so if we don't take that leap of faith, for example, to lean on another person, or to say no, or to say, actually, I love this music, even if you don't, those kinds of things, we don't ever actually get the opportunity to see that those beliefs that we formed in childhood don't have to be operating in our adult relationships.
Yes. And I know we're wrapping it up, but that dovetails or brings up to mind, as far as feeling and having deep connection, is being able to be that authentic self, like you spoke to earlier. And when we negate those inner, those nudges, then we're not being authentic. So even
Yeah.
if we stay in connection, it's like it's not really feeding us, because we're not even being who we really are.
Right. Right. And these two, our authenticity and our belonging, are two fundamental needs. And when we can have both of those in a relationship, we've got it. Whatever kind of relationship that is. When we're able to be ourselves and we're able to feel a sense of belonging with another person, that's relationship gold.
All right, that was it. We hit. I always get that felt sense. Okay, that was it right there. So, Angela, how can people find you? Because they have a lot of good content that's online, that you can meet with them, or do online courses. So please tell the people how to connect with you.
Yeah, you can find us at alchemyoflove.org, and come check out we've got lots of free programs in addition to the quiz. And yeah,
Are you on social media at all?
we are not on social media.
I love that. Good for you guys, actually.
Yeah, we decided we could either do really deep work or we could be on social media posting all the time, and we opted for the doing the deep work. So yeah.
I think that's great. Well, you have it here. The one stop, the website is the place to find Angela. Again, to connect with me, you can find me at thefeelgoodinstitute.com. And signing off for now, keep going, keep growing. And ultimately, if you do those two things, you'll keep glowing. Bye for now.